like to welcome everybody today to the event, which is organised by the Gerry and District Historical Society. We are privileged to have with us today a local South Coast elder, Uncle Gerry Moore, who will be speaking to us about the history of Gerry and the Shoalhaven from an Aboriginal perspective. Many of us here and know a lot about local history from the colonial perspective, but we don't often have the opportunity to hear about this history from an Indigenous perspective. It's all right. We are also privileged to have with us today a highly respected elder and community leader from the South Coast, Auntie Ruth Sims. Auntie Ruth is also a lifetime member of the New South Wales Aboriginal Education Consultative Group. Thank you for joining us today. I would now like to invite Auntie Ruth to come to the stage to give us a welcome to country.
Ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests, everybody's important. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the traditional custodians of the land on which we're now meeting. I'd like to pay my respects to my people, past and present, and acknowledge the future. And I'm very, very happy as a human being that Margaret, with the Gerry Historical Society, has done this. Look at all the people, packed house. Thank you for coming.
We're privileged to have with us today Uncle Gerry Moore. He's a Yuin elder from Wreck Bay, with links to the Geringer, Wadi Wadi Dharawal and Wandi Wandian people of the Shoalhaven and South Coast. He is somebody who has a foot in both worlds. He's a respected elder with extensive connections in the Aboriginal community and also has more than 40 years' experience as a senior administrator in Aboriginal affairs. At the age of 35, he was the youngest National Commissioner to be elected to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission in Canberra. And he has also been, there's a long list, the CEO of SNAKE, the Secretariat of National Aboriginal and Islander Child Care, that's the peak body representing the interests of Aboriginal children, the CEO of the New South Wales and ACT Aboriginal Legal Service, the Chair of the Aboriginal Housing Development Committee and a board member of the New South Wales Aboriginal Housing Office, a board member of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples and Chair of the Nowra Local Aboriginal Land Council and currently a board member. But wait, there's more. He currently sits on about 7 different boards. One is he's a round table member of the Australian Bureau of Statistics. He's also a director of Fund and On Trust. And he's a founding member of the Shoalhaven Walking Together Alliance. In January 2020, he was made a member of the Order of Australia for services to the Aboriginal community. And now I'd like to ask Uncle Gerry, firstly, welcome, and also this was your idea to come here today and to approach the Gerry Historical Museum. Could you share with us why you wanted to do that?
I think I had this upside down, which doesn't surprise me. Ruth's gone. I can say whatever I like now. She gave me strict instructions to be on my best behaviour, so I'm not going to tell any jokes. Why did we want to do what we're doing today? We have a lot to offer, as you would have heard Auntie Ruth say, about a beautiful culture that's survived many, many years. But we've got a lot to ask for in return, or be able to share with each and every one of you. And what I've learnt in my later years is that there is such an untapped knowledge base of people out there that we could be communicating with, and unfortunately many people don't know how or when or why to connect with our people. And so I thought, you know what, staying with our historical societies and other organisations, it would be great if we were able to come together, share knowledge, share wisdom, and get a better understanding of who we are as Aboriginal people and all of the wonderful things that the Berry Museum does, along with the Nowra Historical Society, the Kangaroo Valley Historical Society. We've been missing out on an education that we should have got as kids about all things Aboriginal. And Lisa, that's probably one of the main reasons I wanted to be able to talk to people and use whatever skills I've got to reach out and educate people about Aboriginal issues that didn't get that opportunity when we were all young. So that's one of the main reasons.
So let's get to know you a bit better. When Aboriginal people meet one another for the first time, they often say, where are you from and who are your mob? So could you share with us where you're from and who your people are?
Sure. Well, you know what? Originally, I'm from here in Berry because I was one of the many Aboriginal people who were born in David Berry Hospital. And like Auntie Ruth said, we were born there, or, allowed to be birthed there, because one of the good things David Berry done was have an Aboriginal ward, if you like, and a welcoming knowledge that our people were welcome to come and have babies there. And that was because we couldn't have, or our mums couldn't have babies in Nowra, basically. And the closest hospitals were Milton Ulladulla and Kiama, then Port Kembla. So everyone in my generation and a little bit older were all born in Berry Hospital. And one of my older brothers, who's named Gerry, that I talk about a little bit later, he was not only born there, but he came back to die there, basically. So he done a full circle. And sad, but that's history. You asked where my mob from? Wreck Bay is where I grew up, with links to Gerinja, because my dad actually, or his mum passed away giving birth to him, and he was the youngest of 5 kids. And when I say Gerinja, I'm talking about Rosebery Park at Orion Point. Mum was born in Kiama Hospital and lived at Hill 60. all of my mob that I grew up with were basically either at Wreck Bay or Gerinja, and so that's where I guess my mob come from. And there's been, lots of sad stories told about growing up on the mission, and we should never forget them. But we should always remember that there are good stories too, fun stories about growing up. We never starved because we had the ocean as our kitchen pantry. And all of the things Auntie Ruth just talked about are all true. And especially about the moray eels. Look, that's proof. Nah, it's not. My brother cut that off the lawnmower. Which is just as bad. Where do I come from? I got links to Berry, Gerry, which is Gerry Bailey, or Shalavan Heads, Gerringong, Minamurra, Jamberoo, Kangaroo Valley, and then down to Ulladulla. So it won't be probably a surprise to people, knowledgeable people like yourselves, that we had many Aboriginal camps and communities in each of those different locations. So when you say, where do your mob come from? We come from the land, and the land is all of those different places.
I can't quite see easily behind me, but I think we have a few photos of you when you were a kid.
You can't see as clear as I can, but I can promise you I don't have webbed toes. And what a handsome looking devil. Clothes fresh from the jumble sale that our mums used to go to maybe once a month, and it was a great place to grow up in, don't get me wrong.
And we've got one more of your dad, I think.
Yeah, that's my dad. His name was Archibald John Joseph Moore, but he snuck in another name and told us he was Archibald John Joseph Frizzleberry Moore. So we didn't find out until late, that he was only just pretending, or gammon, as we say. But him and Uncle Jock Timbry, we were one of a small number of families that first settled out in Wreck Bay, and which was a fishing village. And the fishing was really great because we didn't only just catch the fish, everyone got a feed. So that was how our community worked, and what was left over went to market. And I don't know, they started off going by horse and sulky, and then Uncle Charlie had a truck that I reckon your mum and her machine that she came in on would go faster. It was an old truck that didn't go fast. But, there were lots of good things about growing up in a fishing village because you never starved. You had to learn how to, be part of the community and go and pull the nets in and do all of that sort of stuff. And it was great.
Okay. maybe just a bit of a change of direction. When we look at the photo on the flyer for this event, you look a little bit different. What happened to your beard?
Both funny and sad. The sad part was the reason I done it was to raise money for blood cancer, and I guess the funny part of it is I look like a thumb puppet after I got it all cut off, but I raised $14,740 to and you know what that tells me? That we are a generous community. I mean, not all of that came from locally, but it just shows you the spirit of generosity that dwells within this beautiful community that we call the Shoalhaven, and that makes me feel really proud. And people were walking past me in my own office and not recognising who I was. So.
Okay. Let's move on to a little bit of local history. Before some of the early explorers, Throsby and settlers like Alexander Berry came, some of the first points of contact between Aboriginal people and those who came from foreign shores were with the cedar cutters, who operated in the Shoalhaven between about 1810 and 1815. What can you tell us about what happened during those first moments of contact between the cedar cutters and the local Aboriginal people here?
Well, what I can tell you is that if we were to go back in time, we would be living in a heavily forested area, and especially of red cedars. And the cedar cutters, or the cedar pirates as they were called, were partly people who came out on the boat to the colony. Some of them did their time and then, were pardoned, and that's what they did for their existence. Some of them were just in it for the money, because a lot of the timber that come from the Shoalhaven, and especially up the river, and it's well documented that a lot of the timber from here in the Shoalhaven ended up back in England, because they had to have ballast for the ships. They came out with a lot of people and cargo, but they had to, have something heavy to go back with. And they took all your trees and our trees. And with that, sadly, they took away our livelihood, because all of the animals that lived in the trees and grew in the ground and depended on that sort of afforestation disappeared. And so our possums that we used to use for clothing and food, and a lot of the other animals, they were, pushed off their land. And it's sad, because the timber was taken. Some tell us that it ended up in Buckingham Palace's furniture. So if you get to go over to England and get to sit down and have tea with the king, might be sitting on timber from here in the chalet. So yeah, look, the timber cutters were not real good people either. They, in order to get that timber, a lot of our people were murdered, and not only did our mob try to retaliate by trying to protect what we had, but spears weren't as obviously threatening as guns. So lost a lot of lives, and yeah, when the land was replaced with sheep and cattle, and our mob was starving, you're naturally going to get whatever you can. And our mob, would get sheep. I'm scared of sheep. I reckon they bite. But yeah, sheep and cows and whatever. So, they're the things that were a bad counterbalance, if I could put it that way. You take the land, you take the trees, you take the food, you take the clothes, you try and feed yourself, scuffles break out, and massacres happen. And we've had massacres in Minamara, very close to us, up at Appin, and it was a bit strange, but one person who when talking about massacres, said, oh no, the only massacre that happened here in Australia was down in Tasmania when our friend went mad with a gun down there and killed a lot of people. And that was his only understanding of a massacre. But out of bad things always comes good things, and those massacres are now being memorialised, not just by our mob, but by the wider community, and that's a real part of healing that you've got to get together. And some of these families are actually related to some of the people who did the massacres, and that's a very big thing to front up to, isn't it? And like I said, out of bad comes good.
And so that really starts the discussion about that dilemma that local Aboriginal people must have felt when the colonisers arrived. The dilemma being, do you resist and fight, or do you find a way to coexist? And for some of the local Aboriginal people, like Broughton and Broga and Bundle, they found a way to coexist through acting as Aboriginal guides for Charles Throsby and the early surveyors like Oxley and Meehan. So what can you tell us about the roles that Broughton, also called Tudwig, and the other Aboriginal guides played in opening up this area and showing those early explorers the way?
Yeah, well, we wouldn't be sitting here today if it wasn't, maybe we wouldn't be sitting here today if it weren't for people, our warriors, named Tudwig or Broughton, and Broga, and Bundle, and Timelong, and of others that'll come to me in a minute, but they were the ones who helped Throsby coming down from Parramatta through Moss Vale and down through the valley, eventually over the Gumbiwarra or Camberwarra mountain, and then out to Jervis Bay. And they were both instrumental in, I guess, not just being guides, but being interpreters and assisting Throsby with, mapping out areas like the Berry Estate. The road that you drive up through Kangaroo Valley, there was a track that went alongside of that, and most of those roads, and including the Hume Highway, were built alongside of the actual tracks that our mob used to travel from place to place. The longest walk I know of our mob was about 600 k's, and there's you wonder, well, how do they walk that far or that long? Well, we did it incrementally. We know where there was food supplies or sources, so we only walked so far. We had elders and young kids that we needed to take on the journey, so you didn't do it all as, a marathon. You did it by the stars, and you did it by what abundance of food was available along the way. And today when people ask me when I go on a walk, I say, no, we've been walking for 65,000 years. I get a taxi.
So there's a fellow called Broga. Broga was Broughton's brother, I think.
Yeah, he was interesting.
That creek.
Yep. We've got a Broga and a Broughton Creek, and you probably travelled over it many times. And Broga, he was related to Broughton, and I think he may have been a brother. He didn't take to being sort of part of the European settlement culture. He lived his own life, and he was busy too. You know why he was busy?
No.
He had 3 wives and a bunch of kids. So he eventually met his demise after having some discrepancies with cedar cutters, cedar pirates, and I think was the first Aboriginal person to be hanged in, I think it was Campbelltown. And that was despite pleas from Throsby talking on his behalf. He, made a plea to the magistrate, and the magistrate eventually said, no, look, I understand why you did what you did, but unfortunately our penal code says that you must be hanged. And he was sadly hanged. And yeah, I hope in Campbelltown, you hear about the ghost on the bridge. I hope it's Broga up there steering everyone.
I think I saw him at the creek one day, actually. just a little bit about the original inhabitants of this area. What can you tell us about the languages that were spoken around here and further south?
Yeah, well, we've got two main languages, and there's possibly a third one that I've heard about in later years. And the languages are Darawal if you live this side of the river, and Durga if you live the other side of the river. And they were our two main languages, but of course they were interchangeable, or, you know, people spoke both because of trade and commerce and where you got your wife or your husband from. And those languages are really important even today because they're now being retaught in the schools, and we quite often sort of come up against barriers when we're talking about who's the traditional owner of which land, you know, if you live on this side of the Shalavan or on the other. And what I do generally is, if I'm giving a welcome to country, is talk about the languages rather than the tribes, because we were tribal. You know, we still have disputes over land today, and who's the traditional owner of this country, who's the traditional owner of that country. So I like to couch it in a way that you're standing on the lands of the Durga and Darawal speaking people because of the movements that our mob, who would walk from Eden or down across the border to a place called Lake Tyre, all the way up the coast, stopping for different ceremonies and trade and all that sort of stuff. And they would come up to the Illawarra, have a big corroboree there, go up further to Lapa and Laparoos and have a big corroboree there. And you always knew which mob came from where because of the markings that they had on their bodies, you know, the paintings. They go from Lapa out to Liverpool, Parramatta, where they'd have a big festival of eels. I hate eels. See? And then from there they would go either down the Hume Highway all the way down to the Murray River, or go back down through Canberra, through Monaro and the Garrigo country, over the snowy mountains, where they'd have a big feed of bogong moths. They're not my favourite either. Let me tell you a little story. A mate of mine and myself had to go up to a training session or a conference up in Coffs Harbour. And when we checked in, the lady was really apologetic and said, look, we've had these terrible infestations of bogong moths. So I'm just warning you in advance that, you know, we've tried to get them out of the rooms, but we just can't seem to get rid of them all. And as she's talking, a bogong moth goes past me, and I go, and she looks up from her paper and she says, what are you doing? I said, oh, our people eat those moths. So, you know, they were once part of our staple diet. Anyway, before I left my motel room the next day, or whenever it was, I made sure there was no bogong moths in there. And I think to this day, she thinks I ate them all. But I only eat them with sunshine milk, So anyway, they would go all the way over the mountain and then back down through Gundin Chamara and Kurnai Gunai country in Victoria and back to Lake Tyers. So we walked a few miles and that's why I get a taxi.
Let's have a chat about Mount Coolangatta. So 1822, Alexander Berry and his business partner Edward Wollstonecraft get a 10,000 acre grant from Governor Brisbane, and Berry builds his homestead at the foot of Coolangatta, but of course that wasn't what it was called by the Aboriginal people. What can you tell us about the significance of Coolangatta and its Aboriginal name?
Yeah, well, like a lot of names that you will hear or read in the Shoalhaven, a lot of them are Aboriginal names and they've just been changed or anglicised. So Coolangatta is actually Coolangatta, Cambawarra is Gumbiwarra. The significance of Coolangatta is that it was a very spiritual place for our mob in terms of making your journey to the afterworld. And it was also reported to be on one side of the mountain a women's place, and on another side of the mountain a men's gathering place. So there's still some, argument about what sort of place it was. But the whole importance of Coolangatta was that if you were to go to a certain place where you would slide off a particular rock, you would go into another dimension or the afterlife, and you would be tested along the way. And if you were a good person in your previous life and you met the tests, you would be able to get reunited with your mom. If you weren't, then you might have ended up in a not so good place, a swampy area. I used to play footy for Bomaderry, and we were the swamp rats. So I think all our mob who didn't make it, we called swamp rats. It's spiritual in that sense that when Berry built his homestead there, it took a lot of clearing and a lot of the animals and so forth. And I think he wouldn't take that property unless he was given 100 convicts. And they formed part of his workforce, and so too the probably many of our mob form part of that working, past of berries. And when the convicts said, I've had enough of this, I'm going to get my own piece of land or whatever, and when our mob said, yeah, you know, bugger this, I'm not getting enough rations or whatever. Berry went over to New Zealand and bought Maoris, our Maori brothers and sisters over here, to continue on what can only be called the slave labour. And a lot of our mob who passed away there, and some non-Aboriginal mob, ended up being in a burial site in Gerry or Gerry Bailey, which is Shoalhaven Heads. So there's more to come on that, because there's been houses built over the top of where the graves are, and we need to come together as a community, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, and work out how we memorialise all of those people who, you know, were buried there, and do it respectfully, so we're not, you know, creating havoc in the community who've bought houses or built houses there, and also memorialise our non-Aboriginal people who also were laid to rest there. So there's a bit of work to be done on that, but I know some really good people who are doing stuff about that right now, and eventually we should get together with community like this and talk about how we can best achieve not just memorialisation, but how we honour and respect all of those people who were laid to rest there.
Let's move on to a more controversial topic, if we can find one that relates to Alexander Berry. So Alexander Berry had an interest in phrenology, and phrenology is the study of skull shape. It was current in about the 1780s to the 1840s. The idea being that the shape of your skull could indicate the character traits and the abilities of a person. And there was a quiet trade between the New World and the old parts of Europe in body parts. And those body parts were sent to places like London, Paris, some museums in Germany, and also Scotland and Edinburgh. And in preparing for this, I did a little bit of research and realised that it was of particular interest for Scottish surgeons in phrenology. And Alexander Berry was a Scottish surgeon. What can you tell us about his interest in phrenology and how that came to influence his actions here when he was in Barrington?
Yeah, well, when the Scottish surgeons migrated here, and they didn't just come here to Australia, they went to India and other parts, and every ship had to have a surgeon, so surgeons were well sought after. So David Berry had really strong links, as we know, to St Andrews University, and that's where he was educated, and so too I think his brother.
Alexander Berry?
Yeah.
Or David, yeah.
I don't know, that one from the berry bush. No. I think it was David Berry. And anyway, There was a real underworld, if you like, back in the day, where seemed to mainly be Scottish surgeons had this obsession with proving through phrenology that people were different. Where that sits unsettlingly here in our community is one of our warriors ended up, who was a good friend, I believe, of David Berry's. He passed away, and David Berry had his body exhumed, I think is the right word, and the skull was severed and sent back to Scotland. And to this day, we're still looking for the skull of Arawara, but we're looking for it collaboratively with people from that university who are wanting to make amends or help find out where that skull is and get it back here so we can properly repatriate it. I think a couple of other skulls, this is from the same time, were rediscovered and sent back to Tasmania, but Arawara's is still missing, and obviously when you're separated from parts of your body, your spirit doesn't rest properly. So, yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do with my finger that my brother cut off. Yeah, it was a real trade that happened, and I've learnt, I guess through you, of another instance where there were some particularly not so good people who were put in places of high regard, or however you want to say it, and they were actually communicating about how they could get skulls to send back to Scotland, and yeah, one of the letters or one of the communiques talks about, there are lots of blacks that could be, where we could get skulls from, but they've been ravaged by disease or killed by, I don't know, things that are massacres, and it's just a sad part of that particular time. And you might think I'm a bit weird, but that's why linking with the Berry Historical Society, the Nowra Historical Society, the Kangaroo Valley Historical Society is really important, because I think we all have a part to play in, the return of remains that were taken illegally, because it got to a point where they were taking body parts back in suitcases so that they didn't have to pay taxes, and it was just rife around that particular time. And because people were doing it not just here in our country but in other countries, still doesn't make it right.
Just looking on a bit further past that, in the 1890s, the Berry brothers had both died, and their nephews, the two Hay brothers, had inherited their estate. And they started to split the estate up into the suburbs of Kiama, Geroa, Bomaderry. They needed cash at that stage. The people who were the Aboriginal community who were living at Coolangatta, where did they go at that stage when the estate started to be broken up?
Yeah, well, this is another sad part of our history. They eventually, my mom, were removed because back in those days, I think Hay had considered that they were menacing blacks and they had to be moved because they had to have a reason to move them. But all our mob ended up basically to the Four Winds, you know, but that's when Rosebery Park was actually, it says in our history books that Gerry went and kindly donated us our own land so that we can live on there. And so Rosebery Park was then put under the administration of the Aboriginal Welfare Board, and most of our mob ended up over there. And there's some very early images of the houses. And as an incentive, David Berry also gave, I think it was £50. I think it was 50, it might have been more, towards building those houses for our mob. If only you could build a house for £50. But look, it's a thriving community. Later on it gets to be known as Geringa, and like many of our communities, we sort of got put on the fringes, but governments and otherwise didn't know back then that they'd be putting us in the best holiday spots that they could have developed, but no.
And let's step forward another decade. It's 1908, and there's another significant development that happens for the Aboriginal community, and that is the establishment of the Bomaderry Children's Home, which ran until
68, I think it was.
1980, I think.
Which once again is a very sad story of stolen generations and assimilation, because once the kids were basically kidnapped, and they were taken by police or anyone in uniforms, and our mob had a real fear of, flash cars coming onto the mission, or in our case, because we were in the ACT, the government cars all had Z plates, red Z plates, and so you learnt very early on in life that if your parents or uncles or whatever told you to scramble, then that was probably the reason why. These beautiful kids ended up being told that they're not black, that they're white, and if any of our mob went to visit them on the at the Bomaderry Children's Home, which is regarded as the birthplace of the stolen generation, not just in New South Wales but right across the country. And it's sad because we used to get a magazine once a month, I think it was, and it was called The Dawn. And you would see all these wonderful glossy pictures of kids, you know, dressed up and looking real happy. But when you pulled back the veneer of what they were actually encountering while they were in the homes, they were basically being trained to be domestics, the girls, and the boys, you know, they were trained to be farm hands or sent away to be farm hands. Some of the people who grew up there, and my family, as well as Auntie Ruth's and other Aboriginal families, you know, they saw our mob go from there to be kicked off or kicked out of the homes, and they try and make their own way back to their communities, and they didn't fit in, you know, because they'd been, what's the word? Institutionalised, thanks Lisa. And so they were not seen as blackfellas, and they were not seen as whitefellas, and they were ostracised basically. And one of the saddest instances that I know of was when a young lad, early 20s, came back to the Bomaderry home, went into the woodshed and committed suicide. And it was because he had no place of belonging and was, you know, taught to be things that he wasn't. And that's just one sad story about that. So when you hear of the stolen generation, it's that it's something you should really sort of take notice of, because we never ever want this stuff to happen again.
Back to the mission, just a little bit more about what your life was like growing up. You grew up on Wreck Bay, Aboriginal Station. I think we have a photo of it here from somewhere in the late 1950s, early 1960s. I'm just going to read out what that small writing says, because people at the back of the room, hello, there's people right out there at the back, hello everybody, including Auntie Ruth, hello. And I just want to let you know what that writing says. It says, visitors permitted between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Visitors must not enter the land or house of any person without the permission of the resident manager. No fishing is permitted on the reserve area by order Aboriginal Welfare Board. So what was it like growing up with those conditions?
I still remember the remnants of the gates still standing that were used to lock us on 7 o'clock each night and then open 7 o'clock the next morning. And you know, I can't find any photos of those remnants, but they will never ever disappear from what's been etched in my mind about those gates. And you know, if you had relatives that wanted to come and visit you and the manager didn't like you and basically said nick off, then you couldn't go in and see your family. But we're not silly. We'd go away and in dark we'd find a way to get to where your families live and you'd see them, and that would have probably upset the managers really big time, because they did have the right to walk into your house. They did have the right to kick people out. They did have the right to do a housing inspection on the spot, and yeah, it was not a good time.
And so I think by the 1965 it was declared an open village at that point.
Yeah, but even before then, you know, I mention always the positives, and us as kids would make our own fun and activities, none of these Star Wars things or whatever you call them now. We'd go to the tip and find like one of them big 10,000 gallon tanks, you know, with the face cut out of it, and we'd jam as many kids as we could inside the tank and run. And if you fell over, you got trodden on, but we would trample the bush, you know, and anything in front of us, and we had a well of a time, you know.
And you wonder why your brother Tom cut the top of your finger off.
Yeah. And, you know, stealing bits of metal or getting bits of tin from the dump was great, because we'd make tin slides and someone would steal fat from out of their houses, and we'd grease the tins up and go flying down the hills at a terrible pace, fast pace. And I already told Lisa this, but this is when I found out I had some Japanese blood in me, because we went flying through a big spider web, which made me go. That was my attempted karate. But, you know, we'd rip the backside out of our trousers and go home and get a switch for doing it. But they were fun times, so it was what you made it.
So we only have one or two questions, and then I think we'll ask for questions from the floor. The next one, E.T., is I think we've got a picture of your maternal grandfather's certificate of exemption. I'd never heard about these before, but again, I'm just going to read these words out here because it's illegible for most people to read. It's dated the 16th of March 1948, and it says, "This is to certify that James Bloxham, half Aborigine, aged 50 years, residing at Berry, New South Wales, is a person who, in the opinion of the Aborigines Welfare Board, ought no longer be subject to the provisions of the Aborigines Protection Act and regulations." What were these certificates all about? What was the effect of them, and why did people apply for them?
They were called dog tags, and what they were basically was a ticket for you to be able to go into a pub and mix with non-Aboriginal people, go into a shop and try on clothes. They were basically an identity card that said that you were good enough to live in society outside a mission, but you weren't allowed to go back to the mission. It was, a get out of jail free card from one point of view, but it was just a tracking device on you as another. And many of our mob, and they used to advertise it in the Dawn regularly about, these are our new citizens and they are worthy of getting an exemption certificate, and they've proven themselves to be good Aboriginal people. And it was, degrading, patronising,
Again, let's move to recent history. The referendum, 2023, that's where you and I met on the campaign trail. The referendum was about Aboriginal people seeking constitutional recognition through a voice to Parliament. We know that referendum failed, but we also know that 6.2 million people voted yes. That was 40%. But Berry was a really strong yes. Berry was 53% yes. And Kangaroo Valley was the strongest vote in Gilmore at 63% yes. Can you tell us how you felt after that referendum vote came in, and how have you processed those feelings in the last year and a half since then?
Well, I didn't go to work for a week. I crawled under a rock or under a blanket. I felt so sad and disappointed, and it really affected me, and it affected many of our people, and for reasons that, from the misinformation and disinformation that certain so-called Aboriginal leaders were assisting the right-wing element of government with, to even some of our own mob not really understanding or agreeing with the referendum, because we're individuals, we all want, different things, and some of our mob wanted a treaty first, and we weren't at a stage to do that. And I think I've had mixed feelings about Albanese pulling the lever on announcing the referendum when he did, but sitting back now and analysing and letting that sink in, every one of you in this room, gives me a purpose of having the opportunity of letting you know about Aboriginal people, about how we feel, about knowing a bit more, of our spiritual side, of where we lived, what we ate. If we would have done this before the referendum, I think there might have been a different outcome. Or I'll go back even further in a time machine and say, many of us who, are of a a nice mature age, I'll say that. If you learnt about Aboriginal people in schools back then, I mean, we were still standing up and, you know, singing God Save the Queen and all that sort of stuff, and not one thing about the beautiful, resilient culture that you have on your doorstep, and how learning about Aboriginal people and not what you see on Sky News or, you know, the bad media bits, because good stuff doesn't make good publicity. It's always the bad stuff. But I see the opportunity of talking to people like yourselves to allow you to get a better understanding of me and, you know, my journey, and become allies, and then teach your kids and your grandkids when, you know, something comes up about being Aboriginal or this, that or the other. Because it's a top-down and a bottom-up approach, I see it as. The bottom-up approach is we've got a lot of young leaders coming through and they're teaching kids language in the school, not just Aboriginal kids, non-Aboriginal kids, and they love it. They're learning Aboriginal studies in some of the schools, and that's the bottom-up approach. My approach is the top-down, and that's tapping into the minds and hearts of people like yourselves, because it's never too late to learn, and it's never too late to teach other people. And that's why I cherish the opportunity to come along and speak to each and every one of you today.
Could I ask everyone to join me? Thanking Auntie Gerry.